Welcome to part 3 of project E55 ASL, and this video is going to be about finishing up with the manual swap, because in the last part I made a few custom billet aluminum parts in order to fit this clutch, the clutch from the 350Z transmission, onto this engine. So in this part I'm going to be fitting the rest of the transmission onto this engine. The problem with that is that the transmission and the engine have two completely different bolt patterns, because obviously they're from two completely different cars. So in order to fit them, I'll need to make a custom bell housing adapter in the middle. My plan for this bell housing adapter is also to make 4 bolting points on this bell housing adapter, using which this adapter is going to be able to solid mount to the chassis. And the point of that is so that the engine and the transmission are not just dead weights in the car, they're actually going to be contributing to the strength of the chassis. So yeah, that's the plan with this bell housing adapter, but let's see how it actually goes. For making this bell housing adapter, I'm just going to be using sheet steel. This is about 5mm thick, and there's going to be 2 of these. So the plan is that, well, I'm going to cut a big hole in the center of this, which is going to be the same size as, well, the hole on the engine over there, so to clear the flywheel and the clutch and everything. And then it's going to have the same bolt pattern on it as that engine, so this sheet is going to be able to bolt there. And then I'm going to make another one of these sheets for the transmission, which is going to be able to bolt to that transmission, which is basically going to be the same thing, like the same shape as this. And then the gap left in the middle of these 2 sheets, I'm just going to fill it with some more sheet metal, so sheets going like this, and also in a zigzag pattern in between. So I started off by cutting the steel with a plasma cutter. This was the flange that was going to bolt to the Mercedes engine. Here's a bit of a trick for cutting a circle with a plasma cutter. You can just add like one of those bolts and a wire to the plasma cutter, and then when you move it, it's just gonna cut in a circle. And after the plasma cutting was done, I just hit it with the hammer a few times, and the piece from the center just fell out. For cutting a straight line with a plasma cutter, I just used this aluminum bar and I clamped it to the metal sheet, so it gave me a good straight line to cut against. And after all the plasma cutting was done, I had to clean everything off with an angle grinder, because the plasma cutter definitely doesn't leave the cleanest cut. So now I have the steel roughly cut in the shape I need, and the next thing I have to do is I have to mark all the points where I have to drill my holes. For this one, I thought I'd measure the holes before, but then I found an easier way. What I'm just going to do is I'm simply going to put this adapter onto the transmission, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use a marker and then mark all the holes from this side, because all the holes are open from one side. This transmission, by the way, was the old automatic transmission from my E55, so obviously it had the same bolt pattern as this engine. That's why I was using this to copy the bolt pattern. And after that, I just center punched all the holes where the marks were. That's just to make sure that when I'm drilling the holes, the drill bit doesn't slide around. And yeah, after that, then I just drilled all the holes. After that, I had to plasma cut this place for where the starter goes, and also plasma cut holes on the side where the alignment dowels go. So now I've bolted the flange onto the engine, and there's one more thing left to do. I have to make these things for the alignment dowels, because right now I have made the holes for the alignment dowels slightly bigger. So there is a bit of slack in the whole adapter. I can move it around, which shouldn't be the case, because this thing should go on the engine like only in a certain position, because like the transmission input shaft, when I put the transmission on for the final time, it does have to line up exactly with the center of the crank and everything. If it doesn't line up, then it could be putting pressure on the transmission input shaft, which might damage the bearings or something over time. So yeah, that's why everything does have to be aligned. The size of these alignment dowels is 15mm. There are 2 of them. One is on this side and one is on the other side. And what I'm going to do is I have these nuts that I've drilled an exact 15mm hole in. I couldn't find any washer or anything that was exactly 15mm, so I had to drill a hole in these ones to make them exactly 15mm, so that when they go on the alignment dowels, they don't have any free play, like they go on the exact position. So I'm just going to weld these 2 on here, and they're also going to act as a washer for the bolt that goes in here. This is what the flange looked like after everything was done, and after that I had to start work on the other flange, the one for the 350Z transmission. So for this one I did the same thing, just plasma cut a hole in the center, and then this time the only difference was that I followed the bolt pattern from the 350Z transmission. Here's a final look at the flange that is going to go on the 350Z transmission. So after plasma cutting the hole in the center and all of that, I also plasma cut these things on the sides. This is just because with the flange that goes on the engine, it's going to be right behind this one. So in order to bolt that flange to the engine, the bolts actually go on these points. So in order to torque those bolts down, I had to leave the space in this one. All these smaller holes are the holes using which this flange is going to get bolted to the transmission. And I've also left 2 holes for the alignment dowels, because there's 2 alignment dowels that are going to align this thing to the transmission as well, just like there were 2 alignment dowels on the engine. But these alignment dowels were fairly easy, because these are just 2 rods that are going to come out of here. They're 3/8 of an inch. To fix the alignment dowels in position, I just bolted this flange onto the transmission, and I put this 3/8 rod, like I put the rod in and then I cut it to size, and then I just welded the rod there. And after that, I also welded these nuts on because the bolts actually have to bolt into this adapter. So that's why it needed to have nuts on one side. So now I have the transmission flange bolted to the transmission and the engine flange bolted on the engine. The next thing I have to do is I have to put this transmission on the engine and then line them up properly and then weld the part that goes in between so that like this can all be one adapter. Next I put the transmission in its proper place, and this was my least favorite part because it took a lot of effort like aligning this transmission properly to the engine. So after several hours of trying to line the transmission up with the engine properly, I have managed to do it. And now when I spin the engine, everything spins freely, and even the clutch is engaging and disengaging, and everything is working properly. The way I finally aligned the transmission and the engine was that I have two hydraulic jacks. I have one hydraulic jack at the back and one at the front. The one at the back, I was using it to angle the transmission this way, and the one at the front was to lift the front of the transmission up so that the transmission isn't leaning against the transmission input shaft, and the transmission input shaft is like nicely centered in like where it should be. Because if the transmission input shaft is always under load, then it would wear the bearings out in no time at all. Next, what I had to do was I made these wooden blocks, like I cut these wooden blocks to size. This is to space the adapter properly because this has to be like, this gap has to be really exact. If the gap is too much, then the clutch will not engage properly, and if the gap is too little, then the clutch might always stay engaged. So this gap has to be really exact, and it also had to be the same in all four corners, because if the faces of the transmission and the engine are not aligned, even if they're slightly off, when you spin the engine doesn't spin freely. On the whole transmission you can see it wobbling like this. So that is what was happening before when I didn't have the alignment right. That's why I was trying to turn the engine by hand and also using the starter, and it actually took me really long to get this right. I also had to connect the clutch and everything and like engage and release the clutch a few times, putting it in different gears, all of that. And now finally everything is working properly. I can actually show you that by connecting the starter. So if I spin the engine now, so now that everything is lined up properly, the next thing I have to do is I have to weld these two flanges together so it's all just one solid adapter, not two separate flanges. So to do that, my plan is that I got these flat bars cut to size. The thickness of these is exactly the same as the gap between these two flanges, so they can be welded in between these. So what I'm planning to do is that I'll start off by like welding these edges because they're accessible right now, but later I'll have to unbolt the transmission and the engine and like take this adapter off and then weld all the inner parts to make everything really strong. The only thing I have to be really careful of while doing this is that I can't afford any welding warps, because if this thing warps when I'm welding it, then obviously these measurements will go off, and even if they're slightly off, this thing wouldn't work properly. So I'll have to be really careful about that. After welding all the inner part and also adding some additional supports where it needed that, I got to welding these 4 tubes on 4 of the corners of the adapter. This was to reinforce the bolting points where this adapter has to bolt to the chassis of the car. And here's what that looked like after it was done. After this, I just primered and painted the part. That's just so that it doesn't get rusted over time. And here's a final look at the adapter after everything is done. I did screw up on the paint a little, so it's stripping down from a few places, but I don't really care about that. It's just a functional part after all. Yeah, so these are the bolting points on the sides using which this adapter is going to bolt to the chassis of the car. By the way, if you're making this for a production car, you don't actually need to make this adapter this big. You can actually like just cut a circular edge on the outside too, so the adapter is only this small. You don't need this extra space. My only regret with this one is that I have made it a bit too heavy. It's 8 kilograms. the complete adapter. I was expecting it might be somewhere around 5 kilograms, but no, it's actually heavier. But then again, it is going to be contributing to the strength of the chassis, so there are going to be several tubes that because of this construction I'm going to avoid. Like for example, if this adapter wasn't there, I would have needed a cross member, like something holding the diagonals of the chassis together, but since this is going to be bolted now to the chassis, I won't need that. So depending on how much weight I save, this will definitely end up saving me weight rather than making the chassis way heavier. Looking at the other side of the adapter, this is what the other side looks like. And yeah, these are the bolting points where it's going to get bolted to the chassis. So I'm going to be using something like this, like a bolt like this. It's not going to be this exact one, but something of a similar size. So it's going to go in here like this, so you can see the hole is of the perfect size. And yeah, that's how it's going to bolt to the chassis. The only thing left to do now is to bolt this adapter to the engine and to the transmission and hope that everything still lines up. Putting everything back on turned out to be easy enough because this time the alignment dowels actually kept everything in place. So it was just a matter of like putting the adapter on and then like putting all the bolts in and then torquing them to the proper specification. I torqued these bolts to 45 millimeters, which is slightly higher than what Mercedes recommend, but it's still going to be fine. And once that was done, it was time to put the 350Z transmission on. It was a little difficult to put the alignment dowels in. Thinking in hindsight, I should have made the alignment, like the rods I used for the alignment dowels, slightly smaller, just so that the transmission is easier to slide on. But since they were pretty much the exact size, that's why it takes a bit of effort to put this transmission on those alignment dowels. Bolting the top bolts was easy enough, but the bolts at the bottom for this transmission were a real pain because they're actually going in from the other side. So that space now is in between that adapter. So you can imagine how small that space is. After that, I torqued all the bolts down, and the most satisfying thing at the end was that I finally had a Mercedes M113K engine actually bolted to a manual transmission. So that is going to be everything for this video. The manual swap is finally complete, and really happy with the way everything is going so far. But what I'm even more excited about is the next part, because now I finally get to start work on the tube steel chassis. The next part is going to be about actually making the central part of the chassis, like the monocoque you can call it, where the driver and the passenger sit, and everything in front of that and everything behind that is literally just going to bolt onto the monocoque. So that's like the central part of the car. So yeah, really excited to start work on that. That's finally when this car will start taking shape, or at least the skeleton of the car, you can say, will start taking shape. So yeah, definitely try to stay tuned for that. This is everything for now, and thanks for watching.